Hello, good afternoon to you all. My name is Laure and I'm a project manager within HEC Executive Education. Welcome to this webinar, HEC Alumni webinar in collaboration with HEC Paris Executive Education. We're happy to see you. We have about 45 participants who will be connected throughout this webinar from all over France and over the world. Just a few guidelines for today's session. Your microphone will be muted all the time. To interact with us, and please do, with each other, please do use the chat window at the bottom right of your screen. Do not hesitate to ask as many questions as you want. We'll set some time aside at the end to the session to answer the question, but also Dorie will be able to answer some of the questions during the webinar. If you have any problem with any audio or visual problems, just write a little chat on the chatting window. Finally, I would like to ask you just some patience at the end of the webinar. 2 extra minutes at the end of the session. We have evaluation and we would like you to fill out. Very interested with your feedback and to see what we did good, what we did wrong, and how we can improve ourselves. And now let me introduce you to Dorie Clark, who will lead the webinar. Recognized as a branding expert, Duke University professor, Dorie Clark is a best-selling author and consultant of various Fortune 500 companies such as Google, Morgan Stanley, and the World Bank. We're very happy to welcome again Dorie to this webinar. Now, welcome Dorie, and I think it's over to you, and I will come back to speak to you all at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. Great to speak with you. Hopefully everybody can see me and hear me appropriately here, and welcome. So I know that if you are in Europe, it is Friday evening. So I have an important responsibility, which is instead of going out and having wine and cocktails, you are here talking with me about personal branding. So we have to keep it exciting. And that is what we're going to try to do for the next hour. So let's dive right in. At any point, you guys can feel free to type questions into the chat box, and I will either answer them at the time, or we'll have time for questions at the end. So we will try to get to everything. But let's take a step back, right? Let's talk about why this is useful, interesting, important. Why are we bothering to spend our Friday night talking about personal branding? Well, I wanted to just give you guys a little bit of context. This, as you can probably see here, this is the front page of a newspaper. It was the front page of a newspaper that I used to work for. I started my career as a print reporter, and I have this particular page because it was the very first time, you can see if you squint very closely, that I got a front page story. So it was very significant for me. So for about a year after I finished graduate school, I was a newspaper reporter. And unfortunately, this may not come as a surprise to you now in 2017, but I got laid off from my job. And that was a big surprise for me in 2001, because we forget now, but things can change almost instantly. The year 2000 was actually the best year in history, the best year of all time in terms of newspaper revenues. Newspapers were a cash cow. They were a lucrative industry in 2000, and then almost immediately, when the threat of the internet just finally sank in, it's been just this terrible downhill trajectory. And at least in the US, 40% of newsroom journalists have lost their jobs in over the past 15 years. So we're not surprised now, but at the time it was pretty alarming and stunning. And what I came to realize through my experience of being laid off very early in my career is that, number one, things are often a lot less stable than we might hope or imagine them to be. And number two, the biggest asset that you have at your disposal is your personal brand. Because if you have a strong enough brand, people will seek you out. And no matter what happens in the broader economy, you will be okay, because when people find out that you are available, they're going to say, wow, that's great. We want to do business with you. And in fact, that actually is what happened to me when I got laid off as a reporter. I couldn't get another reporting job because the industry was really contracting at the time. But I had covered politics. I was a political reporter, and I ended up getting approached by one of the people that I used to interview as a source. And he was consulting on a governor's race at the time, and they needed a press secretary. This gentleman knew I was out of work, and so he hired me to do that. And that actually started the second phase of my career, where I did political communications, ultimately leading to me being a press secretary on a US presidential campaign. So your brand is what protects you. Your brand is what gives you career insurance in an uncertain industry, in an uncertain marketplace. So that's pretty powerful. But okay, let's talk about the sort of elephant in the room, right? We're all busy here. Our lives are often like this tube station. We are pressed in a million directions. A study by the Radicati Group in 2015 actually showed that the average professional sends or receives 122 email messages per day. I mean, it's horrifying, but for most people, when I say that number, they're like, yeah, that sounds about right. The problem is that number is growing at a compounded annual rate of 15%. This is a blight of information overload that we are not escaping anytime soon. It's just getting worse. And so what it means is that because everybody is pulled in a million directions, their attention is being dragged around, they are not paying that close attention to you. And the reason this becomes problematic is that if other people are only kind of paying half-hearted attention to what you're up to, it means that they are not necessarily registering the changes in the evolution that you're going through. If they first got to know you 5 years ago, this is especially true if you've been in the same company, if they first met you 5 years ago, they're probably thinking of you in a very similar way to the way that they did 5 years ago. Meanwhile, you've been learning, growing, taking on new responsibilities. You might have gotten a new degree, for instance, and they're still like, oh, that cute little intern, right? They don't necessarily understand the full range of what you can do. And so somehow we have to break through that. We have to break through the noise and make sure that we are being heard, that other people really get it, who we are and what we can do and what we are aiming for professionally. So that's the challenge for us, is how do we break through that noise? And in particular, how do we do it in a way that is not like this guy? How do we do it in a way that is not obnoxious and invasive and intrusive? Because that is the problem, right? That a lot of people have with the concept of personal branding. When they even hear the term, many people get instantly turned off and say, oh, I don't want to do this. I don't want to think about this, because it feels a little slimy. It feels a little gross to them. They assume that it's like a car salesman just trying to hand everybody their business cards and be slick. But I really want to emphasize that what we are talking about here is not this, right? I think anyone would say that this is not effective. Being like this guy is bad personal branding. So let me put it into a little bit more context. So if we zoom back in history to get a perspective about how this whole discourse started, it started here. This is a Fast Company cover story from 1997, so 20 years ago. This piece was written by Tom Peters, who you guys may have heard of. He's a well-known management thinker. He wrote the book In Search of Excellence, which was a bestseller, a mega bestseller in the 1980s. And he really coined the phrase personal brand. He kind of began the discourse around it with this article, The Brand Called You. Now, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, right? You can see that it's laid out to look like a Tide box. So it's kind of winking and nodding at the idea that what bothers some people is, oh, why do I have to think about this? Why do I have to sell myself the way that people sell soaps or detergents? But the truth is, of course, if you're doing it right, personal branding is not selling yourself the way that you'd sell a soap or a detergent. It is absolutely not about putting your finger to the wind and saying, what does the world want me to be, and how can I pretend to be more like that? That is the opposite of what we are talking about. Instead, what we are actually talking about and seeking to do is something very different. It is starting internally and saying, who am I What am I good at? What do I bring to the table? What am I passionate about? What do I want to bring to the table? And then how can I convey that and transmit that effectively so that other people get it and they get why that is valuable and necessary and should be respected? That's what we're talking about. It's an inside out process rather than an outside in process. And so when people say that personal branding is about being fake or being inauthentic, that is absolutely not true. It is in many ways the ultimate inauthenticity, because it's about excavating who you really are and then showing people why that is valuable. That's why I'm passionate about it and have written a number of books about it. So I also want to acknowledge up front, before we dive into the meat of strategies of how to do personal branding, that yes, there are cultural differences, right? So you can probably guess that I'm American, and it is no secret that by and large Americans have embraced personal branding far more than other cultures. That is not to say that every American is really into personal branding. That is painting with far too broad of a brushstroke. It really varies much more by individual. But culturally, if we are speaking really broadly, America is the place where people are kind of into it or more comfortable with it, or at least even if they're not into it, they acknowledge, like, yeah, that's probably a good thing. People should probably do this. Meanwhile, you have a lot of cultures that are not necessarily so comfortable with these concepts, because certainly in Asian cultures, but also in a lot of other places, there's a real value placed on humility, on the idea of deflecting compliments, deflecting attention, that it's considered crass to do it otherwise. And so I want to just let it be known and acknowledge this is not meant to be some kind of a hegemonic, prescriptive webinar where it's like, oh, do it the American way. We're right. What I really want to emphasize is that I think that if we peel back all of the stereotypes and all of the noise about personal branding, at its most core level, it's about understanding who you are and getting people to appreciate that. And I think that regardless of your culture, that is something that is helpful and useful and valuable in your professional life. Now, the tactics and the techniques might vary. How far you amp it up might vary depending on your personal preferences or your cultural background. But I think that the premise and the principle is something that actually is universally applicable. And I'll just mention for people that are interested, I've written a couple of articles about this with my colleague Andy Malinsky in the Harvard Business Review. If you just Google our names together, Dorie Clark and Andy Malinsky in Harvard Business Review, you should be able to find them. One is called How to Adapt to American Style Self-Promotion, and another one is called What to Do If You're from a Country Where Bragging is Bad, or something like that. So those are, that goes into a little bit more depth about cross-cultural issues. But I just want to flag that because it is a valid consideration and concern. But the strategies that I want to talk to you guys about are really much more about, at a foundational level, things that anybody can do, regardless of where on the spectrum they fall in terms of their level of comfort with self-promotion. So, another piece that we'll just kind of lay out, I wanted to kind of lay the groundwork here by sharing this story. This is a woman named Lisa Granick, and I actually profiled her in my first book, Reinventing You. And I feel like her story is kind of powerful and emblematic here because ultimately, when we're talking about personal branding, it's useful in general, it's important in general, but it becomes especially important if you are looking to reinvent yourself professionally. If you are looking to make some kind of a change in your professional life, you want to change jobs, you want to change careers, this becomes really important because whether or not you get hired, whether or not you even get considered, is very much contingent on what do people make of you. What do people think your brand is? What do they think that you can do? And so Lisa, I think, had a really good, she provides a really good model of this because her transition in many ways was so extreme. Lisa was she was training to be a lawyer. She had known for a long time that she wanted to be a legal scholar. And so she had basically done everything right in order to make that happen. She got into the law school at Yale, which is considered the most prestigious in the United States, or at least one of the most prestigious. She then went on and got accepted also at Yale to their doctoral program in the study of law. She won a Fulbright scholarship. I mean, she was just racking up the credits. She had positioned herself so well to be a legal academic. And so she spent in total about 10 years of graduate work studying to do this. And so when she was on the cusp of fulfilling her dream, she was just getting ready to graduate from her program, something kind of terrible hit her, this terrible realization that she did not want to be a legal academic. She really did not want to do it. She was looking at her friends who had graduated a few years before her, and they were all miserable. And when she finally saw what the job was really like, that's not what she wanted to do at all. And that's a kind of scary feeling, to feel like you have invested 10 years of your life doing something that maybe now you're going to walk away from. And so a lot of people would probably just suck it up at that point. They'd probably say, you know what, too bad. I've invested too much to walk away. I guess I just need to learn to like it. But of course, that's a kind of sad way to have to live. Ideally, we want to be in jobs that bring us joy and satisfaction and fulfillment. But it's tricky, right? How do you make a transition when you have done so much and so intensively in one place? And I think probably a lot of you guys, when you entered HEC, may have similarly been thinking about how to make a transition in your own lives. And so what Lisa did, which I thought was incredibly powerful, a lot of people would just look on the surface of her resume and say, well, the only thing you know how to do is law, so you can either do law or nothing. You can do law or just start at the bottom with, some new thing, which is pretty demoralizing. But Lisa took what I think is a much more clever approach. She didn't look at the titles on her resume. What she looked at was the skills that she had developed in her studies. And she realized something very powerful, which is that, yes, she'd been studying to be a lawyer, but in the course of doing that, she had learned an amazing amount. For instance, in training to be a legal scholar, you actually have to study all these languages in order to be able to do primary source research. And so over this 10-year period, she'd become fluent in French and Russian and Spanish, and she'd become proficient in Italian. That was pretty good. Another thing that she realized was that she had become really an excellent public speaker. When you're studying to be a lawyer, you do a lot in oral argumentation. That's how you win your cases. She had become very good at persuasion. So as she was looking around and thinking about what she cared about, she realized the thing she was really interested in, even though she didn't know very much about it at all, was wine. You can see her here pictured in a vineyard. And she, a lot of people would just say, well, Lisa, you don't know anything about that. You don't have any contacts in the industry. You don't have any background. Good luck, but it's not going to happen. But Lisa realized that she had some hidden assets. When you work in the wine world, fundamentally, any job in the wine industry is a sales job, right? You have to be able to sell and persuade people, because why else would somebody buy a $100 wine versus a $2 bottle of wine? Fundamentally, that's sales. That's explaining to people why the wine is really worth it. And she realized that she had an advantage that most Americans in the wine industry did not, which is that she spoke all these languages and could speak with vintners and farmers in their native tongues. And so with that, she actually embarked on this second career, and now has developed this dream career as a wine expert who consults with foreign vintners to help them bring their products to the United States. But it was because she looked beyond what was obvious on her resume. She was willing to look under the surface and see really what her skills were in order to take control of her personal brand. Because this is the biggest message here, that ultimately, if you leave the interpretation of your personal brand up to other people, it's not going to go that well. Because frankly, they're too busy and they're not going to be paying very much attention to what you're doing. They're going to just come up with some stupid explanation of who you are. It's going to be very facile or surface level. They'd be like, well, she's a lawyer. You have to take control of understanding what skills you really bring to the table and be able to convey that to other people like Lisa did so that they can get on board and really understand. We have to be in charge of telling that story to other people. So fundamentally, as we are taking control of our personal brands, what I've come to realize in the course of researching it now over a matter of years is that there's a 3-step process involved in really owning your personal brand. First, it's about identifying your brand, which we're going to talk about in a minute, because we all have a brand currently, right? People think something about you. So the first step is figuring out what that is. The second step is really creating a future vision, defining what you want your brand to be. So that then when you see, as is the case with almost everybody, that there's a gap between where you are now and where you want to be, you can create a good action plan that helps bridge that gap. And then third and finally, it's about living out your brand. It's about taking action in small ways on a daily basis to make sure that other people really understand and get who you are. Because branding is not this one-time thing that you do and then you never have to do again. People are constantly forming impressions of you. And so you want to make sure that everything that you do is leading to a coherent message that's getting transmitted so that people really understand your potential and what you bring. So we're going to talk about all of those things, but I just wanted to check in here and make sure that folks are still hearing me okay and everything, and also that if you have any questions at this point, feel free to type them in. So just so I know that there's people out there, maybe you can type something into the chat box, like where are you coming from today? Is everybody in France, or are you all over the world? Do we have people people hanging out in Asia at midnight? Like what are you up to? So I'm looking in the chat box here. So please feel free to type anything into the chat box. Let me know who you are and who's here, and any questions that you guys have. And I'm also, Laura, not seeing any chats in the chat box, so I just want to make sure it's working properly. So if you can send me a chat, just so I know and can test it, that would be great. So anyway, you guys can handle all of that. I am watching my chat box like a hawk to make sure that things aren't coming in. So anyway, I'll go ahead and keep going. I'll mention, Laura, that I'm still not seeing anything in the chat box. So I don't know if that's because people are not typing it in, or if it's just not coming through for me. So feel free to type me a message to let me know. But we will proceed because we are rocking and rolling. We are going to keep going until it is time for you guys to go off and have an amazing dinner this evening off in Europe. So let's go. How do we identify our brand? Well, there's an exercise that I share in Reinventing You that I want to tell you guys about. This is just a quick, easy thing that you can do. If you are going out for dinner after this, you can even start it at dinner tonight, right? This is your homework if you choose to accept it. And it is called the 3-word exercise, and it is very simple. So the way that it goes is you reach out over the course of, it could be an evening if everybody's there together. It could be, the next few days. But basically, you reach out to a group of friends and colleagues that know you reasonably well, and you ask them a very simple question, which is, if you had to describe me in only 3 words, what would they be? And the reason that this is useful and important, of course, is that by the time you are getting feedback, by the time you are hearing from the 4th, the 5th, the 6th person, you are absolutely going to start to see commonalities in what their response is. It's a good idea, by the way, to write down what they say, because it's easy for you, if you ask 6 different people and don't write it down, for some of the words to evaporate, and then you won't have that hard data anymore. So write them down, but you're going to see patterns. Now, in most cases, the things you're going to hear are probably things that you will recognize. You'll say, oh yeah, I am like that. Okay. So it's not so much that you're going to hear things about yourself that you've never heard before, right? Possibly, but probably not. I'm assuming that most of you have a decent idea of how you are in the world. But here is the reason this is important. Here is the reason why I suggest this and why I think it matters. And that is the part that we as human beings do not know and cannot know without talking to other people is, what is it about us that other people view as most distinctive, right? Because frankly, we know too much about ourselves, and our vision of ourselves is cluttered and crowded because we know every thought, every little nuance, right? What is really helpful for us is the crystallization and clarity of having people define us in only 3 words, because it forces them to say, well, what's the biggest thing? What's the most important thing? What's the most noticeable thing? And when you see that, when you actually start to recognize it, it gives you hints and clues about what is different about you, what is perceived as being unique about you. And that becomes the thread that you can follow so that you are able to really begin to say, maybe this is a unique strength that I have and that I can leverage. It begins to provide possibilities that you might explore, because frankly, for all of us, because we are in our heads all the time, even if you're really exceptional at something, a lot of the time you don't even know it. You don't even recognize it because it feels normal to you to be very good at it. But when you start hearing feedback from other people, like, no, not everyone can do that, then it begins to show you something. So I'll suggest, if you are up for it, try the 3-word exercise, and you might learn something interesting about yourself. So that's step 1, right? Is understanding what your current brand is. But now we're going to shift into creating your brand. How do you define where you want to go and take the steps to move into that direction? So I'm excited to talk to you about that. But Laura, I just want to, or our technical friends, I just want to mention that I'm still not seeing any chats in the chat box, and so I don't know if it's, oh, good, you're typing now. It looks like I can see it. Good. I just want to make sure that I'm not somehow cut off from civilization, and that that I'm like actually secretly like speaking to no one. So fantastic. Okay, good. So I am in the process now of getting into what will apparently and hopefully be the proper place for me to find everything. So, all right, let's see how we can do that. All right. Anyway, trying to do many things all at once, and it's proving too cognitively taxing for me, I'll be quite honest. So what I'll say to you, Laura, thank you for typing on the host chat box. If there are questions that arise, please type a chat message to me here, interrupt me, ask me the question, and we will do that, because I want to be super engaged, but I am not able to access the chat box myself. Okay, fantastic, team. We are on it. Good. It's just sometimes, you're doing these presentations, it's like, wow, is anyone there? So just want to make sure that we are rocking it together. All right, creating your brand. How do you do that? Well, let's talk about some strategies. So this is a woman named Toby Johnson that I profiled in Reinventing You. And as you can see here from our little photographic images, she had a pretty big transition. In her case, it was extreme. Your transition, if you've been through one, maybe less extreme. Toby was in the U.S. military. She was actually an Apache helicopter pilot, which, as you might imagine, was and is a pretty uncommon thing for women in particular to do. But highly technical, really important skill. So she was this Army helicopter pilot, and after 7 years of being in service, she decided that she wanted to go back into civilian life. So the way that she did this was she applied to business school. She went to a top tier business school, just like you guys, not HEC, but another really good one. And she realized something, which maybe you have seen yourself, which is that she noticed that the recruiting session, like, for internships and things like that, started really early. She'd only been on campus for a month or two, and people were already starting to recruit for summer internships. And she realized once she started doing these interviews that something was not clicking. She was having real difficulty because she was, talking to the interviewers, telling her story about her time in the Army, and they were just like, she could see their thought process. They're like, oh, great, you were a great helicopter pilot. That's wonderful. But what does that have to do with working in finance or working in insurance or working in consumer packaged goods? They couldn't make the connection. They thought it was great that she had been in the Army. That's a lovely thing to do, but they didn't think it was relevant. And the sad part, right, was that most of Toby's contemporaries, because she was in the daytime program rather than an executive program, they had worked for a couple of years out of school. They had these corporate jobs, which were fine. They were good corporate jobs, but if you're 22, 23 years old, you probably have pretty limited responsibility. Toby was in a war zone. She was responsible for not just managing, but responsible for the lives of 30 people. And she was responsible for the maintenance and safety of tens of millions of dollars of equipment. She had had a huge amount of leadership experience and responsibility, and yet they weren't hearing it. She was trying to tell her story, and all they heard was, you fly helicopters, and they didn't get it. And so she realized that she was going to have to change that up, because otherwise her talents, her real leadership experience was never going to be seen or recognized. And maybe some of you guys have felt that way, that you have a lot of talents and experience, and just for whatever reason, people are not hearing it. They are not getting it. And that is the most frustrating thing in the world. And so for her, she realized that what she needed to do was learn to tell her story in language that they could understand. So because really, when it comes down to it, it's not about flying a plane. Who cares if you can fly a plane? I mean, that's nice in the Army, but yeah, it's not really relevant in the civilian world. What is relevant is the fact that she had had leadership experience in these incredibly stressful situations far beyond what any of her contemporaries had faced at that point. And once she was able to reframe the story as one about leadership and leadership experience, that was something they got. That was something that got her noticed. And today, Toby is a really successful rising executive at Pepsi and managed to crack that code. But what really happens is understanding when you have something that they don't, right? Understanding how to tell your story about your unique experiences and convey that, and taking control of your narrative, making sure that it's not just left for other people to connect the dots, but that you connect the dots for them. And I actually have a little diagram about that. So oftentimes what happens, this is where I see a lot of things go wrong when people are telling their personal leadership story, their personal brand story, is they'll often start out and they'll tell where they started, right? So I was doing this and this and this. They'll tell kind of a little chronological story, and then they'll say, and now I want to do blah blah blah. So if it's a job interview, they'll say, and I'm really interested in this position, and I think I'd be great. Excellent. But in between here and there is a chasm. There's a huge chasm, and too many people do not connect the dots, and they just assume that the other person across from them understands how you would get from here to here and just make this leap. But oftentimes people don't understand. I mean, they're pulled in a million directions. They're not that invested in really taking the time to learn and understand. And so they're like, she was a helicopter pilot. Now she wants to sell soda. I don't know. And they default to the person who's easier to hire, because even if they have less experience, they at least come from a corporate background that it doesn't take as much for them to make that leap and to understand how they might fit in to the corporate context. And that's a shame, because it means that some real talents are being ignored and left on the table. So the antidote for this, the way we fix this, is that we connect these dots, right? We have to put them together so that other people can understand how they fit together. So what Toby realized is if it's flying helicopters to selling soda, nobody understands how you make that leap. But if instead you say, you know what, flying helicopters is really about leadership, and what Pepsi needs is leadership. and I can take what I've learned here and apply it. It's a connective strand. I did it here, I can do it there. Then it makes sense. Then they get it. But you have to put it, it seems ridiculous, but you have to make that connection so explicit and put it into literal language so that they can't miss it. And if you can do that, finally, even when it's crowded and noisy, you can break through and get noticed. So this last part here is about living out your brand, right? It's about making sure that on a regular day-to-day basis that you are taking the steps that enable other people to really see who you are. Because it's not just like a one-time thing, like, oh, I branded, now I'm done. It's about conveying an ongoing message. So how do we do that? How do we make sure that we are living in such a way that with everything we do, every step we take, every interaction we have, we are reinforcing rather than somehow complicating or undermining the brand that we want to get out into the world and share with other people. So I want to share some strategies with you about that, and I'll also just jump in at this point, Laura, if there's questions that have come in, things that are relevant to what we talked about so far, if you wouldn't mind pasting them in the host chat box for me, that would be great, because I'd be happy to address them now. And I'll also mention for other people, if you have not yet posted a question, but you have a question, feel free to post them now, and that way we'll get them in the queue, and I would be glad to answer them at the end of the webinar as well. So please feel free to be thinking about that and plug in your questions into the chat box, and Laura will make sure that I see them. So let's move on while you're doing that to talk about living out your brand. So the first thing that I wanted to share is this strategy. This actually comes from research done by a gentleman named Ronald Burt, who is a sociologist at the University of Chicago. And he has done a lot of research into something called network theory. And this is something that is really important for anyone who works in any kind of a corporation or an organization. Essentially, what he is interested in studying is the question of what makes you indispensable in your network. It's a good question, right? Because ultimately, we started this presentation with me telling you the story about getting laid off from my first job. Again, if we really want to think about career insurance, how do we protect ourselves from downside risk in a world of disruption? One of the best things that we can do is invest in trying to find ways to make ourselves indispensable. So how do you do it? Well, what Ron Burt discovered is that the people who are truly considered to be indispensable in their companies are the hubs, right? They're the people. I don't think there's like a late. Oh wait, maybe there is. Maybe I can actually draw something. That would be amazing. Let's see if I can do that. It's oh, can I? I'm learning on the fly here. Here we go. I am drawing for you. If you can be this person in the center rather than the person far out on the perimeter, then that is what makes you indispensable. And I'll explain what I mean by that. It turns out that in their studies of corporate life, you've probably seen this in your own experiences, it is very natural for things to devolve into silos. Just these isolated departments or factions or offices that really should be talking to one another, but they are for some reason not. And as a result, the information that should be transmitted is not transmitted. And so, of course, that leads to a huge amount of waste, as you can imagine. People are constantly reinventing the wheel. They're constantly making mistakes that other people figured out a long time ago, but no one knows. So the truth is, if you can be the person at the center of the node, if you can be connected to lots of different places, rather than just, for so many people, we barely even talk to different people. You have lunch with the same people every day, you work with the same people, you have meetings with the same people. If you can fight that inertia, if you can fight that stasis, and instead consciously seek to cultivate relationships throughout your organization, you are exposing yourself to new ideas, new relationships, new best practices. And so when somebody says something, you can say, oh, they tried that over in the Hong Kong office last year. I should connect you with these people, blah, blah, blah. And they'll say, how did she know that? And that's how you begin to get that reputation for being someone who is indispensable. And so how do we actually operationalize this? I will give you a super quick, easy strategy. And that is, this is something that actually a friend of mine did, which I thought was brilliant. Once a week, just once a week, have lunch with someone from a different department. That's it, right? It seems so simple, but for so many of us, we don't bother to do it. We just, get this rut. We have lunch with the same people, or we skip lunch, or we have lunch at our desk and we check Facebook. If instead you make an effort 50 times a year to reach out and connect with someone that you don't know that well, it helps you build a network that extends far out. Even if it's not even in person, you could each have a sandwich and have a meeting on Skype while you're doing it. That can be a powerful way of connecting with people. So think about ways to make yourself a hub, and it really builds a powerful network. So I want to just address some of the questions that have come in as well. We have a question that Laura typed in here. Thanks to the folks sending it. Chunyan said, the 3-word description from the others reflect their perception toward us. However, nobody knows ourselves better than ourselves. What's more, these 3 words can be something general like nice, dynamic, energetic. So how could the 3-word exercise help us identify our differentiators? So very good points. So I think that it is very true as we're thinking about who we really are. Of course, we want to start with what we believe about ourselves. But the truth is, the hard part is knowing what other people think about us. That's the thing that we don't really have a lot of insight into. There's a quote that I have in Reinventing You from a woman who's an angel investor named Judy Robinette. She said she first heard this as a Hungarian proverb, and it's, if 3 people tell you you're a horse, buy a saddle, which I love. And I mean, basically what it means, of course, is that you might be absolutely convinced that you are not something, or that you are something, whatever it is. But in this case, you might be convinced you're not a horse. But if 3 people are actually saying, no, really, you're a horse, then you need to look at that. And so you could think of yourself as, the most strategic, visionary person in the world. But if for some reason you're coming across as this, kind of tactical, like, oh, you're so detail oriented, you're so precise, you're, all these kind of words that are like the opposite of strategic, then either they're right and you need to reconsider something, or something big is getting lost in translation and you need to fix that. You need to know that so you can fix it. So that's why I'm suggesting that you start out by asking a number of people. Again, you don't want to ask one person, because that one person's opinion could be off the wall. But that's why you ask like half a dozen people. And if you keep hearing the same thing, then you want to say, oh, okay, that's interesting. So also, to your point, the words might be generic, like nice, dynamic, energetic. Actually, I'm going to argue a little bit. I don't know that that's really generic per se, because if 6 people in a row tell you you're really nice, I think that's actually very telling. There's a world of words that people could use. There's hundreds or thousands of adjectives out there. And so if everybody says the first thing about you is that you're nice, they're actually not going to say that about everybody. That is, think about it. There's probably a lot of people in your office that you wouldn't say the first thing that comes to mind is nice, right? And so I think that actually is very telling. Whatever word they use, if you hear it enough, it's saying something. It's saying that you are considered abnormally something, uniquely something. Now, in some cases, you might want to ask yourself, wow, if 6 people say I'm nice, am I actually too nice? Like, am I coming across as like a real softie? Or is it actually that, like, no, it's just the right amount of nice, and that, maybe if I'm in a cutthroat industry, that's actually a value added differentiator, that people think that I'm really pleasant to deal with and everybody else is a shark. So you have to have people around you to help you interrogate that. But I actually think that regardless of what adjectives they use, it is the frequency with which you hear them that's going to be telling. So I hope that that is helpful. So I'll answer here just a second one, and then I'll continue with the official presentation. There's a question from LNG, and it is, what is the best vehicle to promote our brand? So, in some ways, if we're thinking about like channels, some people might say, oh, like, should you do things online? Should you be on Twitter, or should you be on Facebook, et cetera, et cetera? I think in a lot of ways, those are important questions, but they're sort of downstream questions, because in a lot of ways, the strategic work of your brand is done, at a higher level. It's really thinking about like, who are you in the world, and what message do you want to send? But in terms of what channel to use, I would say the questions to ask yourself, because of course it'll be different for everybody, is who is the audience that you want to influence, and kind of who's the target audience that you hope will receive your message, and then where are they already? Because it's always a lot easier to reach people in a place that they're already there, as opposed to making them go somewhere to get it. So for instance, if a thing at your company is that everybody does lunch and learns, well, great. Then maybe if you want to be getting a message out about your expertise about something, maybe you should volunteer to do a lunch and learn. If everybody, let's say you're a journalist, if everybody in your industry is on Twitter, then that's a great place to go for the audience that you want to influence. But in many industries, Twitter isn't so much of a thing, so I wouldn't worry about it that much. So it's really just looking at where the traffic and the momentum is already amongst the people that you wish to influence. So let's go ahead and continue. And to the point about Chunyan's question, and how do you sort of know like what people are thinking, and get the real facts about it. This is a woman named Hank Philippi Ryan. She's another case study from the book, and I included her here because I was really struck by her story. She is a prominent television news reporter in Boston, and but she also has a sideline. And as you can see here, her sideline is writing books. She's a mystery novelist. But the way that she was able to be to become a mystery novelist, of all things, was that she was inspired by her former intern, a woman who was 30 years younger than her, who had become a writer. And when Hank had always wanted to do it, but she had just never thought it was possible. And so when she saw that her former intern was writing a novel, she realized, what, I can do it too. And she told me when I interviewed her for Reinventing You, it's like that Zen saying, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And so I really want to emphasize the importance, A, of consciously creating a network of people around you that you respect and admire, and understanding that, number two, that doesn't always just have to be people older than you or people who are more senior professionals. When we think mentor, we often think, oh, that has to be someone, quote unquote, above us in rank. But instead, I want to really posit a new frame where we can be learning from people who are all around us, our peers, our subordinates, because the truth is, it's a little old school. It's a little outdated to think about someone who's like the perfect vision. You want to be exactly like every facet of what they're doing. Wouldn't it be great if we had somebody like that would take us under their wing? But for the vast majority of us, we just don't have that opportunity. And so instead, if we're cobbling it together on our own, what we need to reframe that as is to think a little bit more about creating what I like to call a mentor board of directors, which is a group of people around you where it's not like you necessarily want to emulate everything about them, but they have like one or more skills, abilities, pieces of knowledge that you admire and want to learn that thing from them. And you make a conscious effort to spend more time with them, and it can really begin to help guide you. So I understand that Benoit has to leave a little bit early, so I want to jump in and just make sure I answer his question. So he says, how to be in a situation when you created a super brand and are selling it well on a resume, but during interviews, recruiters often tell you, you're so great, you're too great for us. We are afraid not to offer you great perspectives in our company, which are worthy of you. We think you'll be bored, you're overqualified. So what do you do with that? Okay, so that is a very frustrating situation to be in, obviously, because we're always told, right? Like be your best, put your best foot forward, and when that is somehow handed back to you and is given to you as the reason why you're not getting the job, that is extraordinarily frustrating. So what I would say is, if you actually, we're assuming you actually do want the job that you're applying for, right? Like, I mean, if they're actually accurate and you would be bored, then maybe it's not the best fit. But let's pretend that you're really interested in the job and you feel like, no way, you're not going to be bored. Then I think the really important thing here is to take the lead in this conversation, because it is the elephant in the room. They are thinking all the while, okay, if we offer him this job, it's going to be a total waste because he's going to leave 2 months later and he's going to be bored with it. And so what you need to do, even before they bring it up, is to take charge of that conversation and to lay it out, to try to allay their concerns proactively. Because if you do that, it really makes a statement and it makes an impression. And so I would try to just steer the conversation, whenever the appropriate juncture comes up, for you to just step up and say something like, one thing I wanted to mention is that I know that in the application form for this, you said you were looking for someone with 5 years of experience. I have 15 years of experience. You might be wondering why I want this job. You might be thinking to yourself that I would be bored if I took this job and that I could be a risk for, leaving early or not being a good fit. I want to just take a minute to explain to you why that is not going to be the case and why I am extremely interested in this position. And then you lay out this kind of detailed pitch and you knock down their assumptions that you're making. Maybe you say, look, I had this experience over here, but your company is totally different. You're in a different field, a different area. It's something that I'm passionate about. This is my opportunity to learn about this particular facet that I haven't done before. You want to really prove that it's a learning opportunity for you and it's something that you're not going to get bored with. And if you can just make a very convincing case to explain that, I think that it will do a lot to knock out their objections proactively. Because if you can control the conversation, then it just helps reshape the dynamic. So I hope that that's helpful, and good luck, because that is a really super annoying situation, and I want you to find something great. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and continue with the presentation. We've got a question that I'll answer in a little bit from Douglas, and if other folks have questions too, feel free again to type them into the chat box. Laura is going to make sure that I get them as well. So what else, as we're talking about how to live out your brand? Well, I wanted to share this story with you. This is actually something from my second book, Stand Out. This is a young woman named Miranda Ashleen Hines, and I loved her story because I feel like it's so counterintuitive in a lot of ways. We hear stories sometimes about people who, they wrote a book and then, they were this nobody and then, oh my gosh, they sell 1 million copies and they're famous, right? And of course, we all know that happens so rarely. I mean, it's like a once in a million chance. So it's not really a real possibility. But what I love about Miranda is that she wrote a book, she published it, and something wonderful happened. But it was not something crazy or outlandish like selling 1 million copies. It was something wonderful, but something that almost anybody could replicate. And that's what I love about it. So in Miranda's case, she was finishing up a master's degree. She was doing a master's degree in arts education. And instead of doing a thesis, which she felt like, no one was going to read, it was just going to sit on a shelf, she asked her advisor if instead of doing the thesis, she could write a book and self-publish it, because she just wanted to make more of an impact. And so the advisor agreed. And so Miranda wrote this book. She wrote this creativity manifesto that she called Don't Make Art, Just Make Something. And so she put that out there And the truth was, it didn't sell that many copies, but that wasn't really the goal. But it didn't sell that many copies. But what she did do was she printed out, bought some copies, she gave them to her friends. And she had one friend who had a job at an arts organization, and she gave him a copy. And when he finished the book, which he liked, he gave it to his boss. And his boss read the book, and he loved it. And so a couple months later, when Miranda had finished her program, she discovered that there was a job opening at this arts organization that she really wanted. So she sent an email over, she sent her resume in, and in her cover note, she said to the boss, "Hey, I think you might have read my book. My friend told me he gave it to you." And so the boss immediately wrote back and said, "Yes, I love your book. Come on in for an interview." So just immediately she got the interview. She went in, had a great chat, got a second interview. When she came in for the second interview, which was with the whole staff of the office, the boss, the first thing he did was say, "Hey, everyone, this is that woman that wrote the book." It made her stand out. And she did get the job. And so for the past several years, she's worked at that organization on the strength of sharing her ideas. And I think that this is so critical. Sometimes people think that, something like writing a book, it's so quixotic, but the truth is, and of course you don't even have to write a book. It could be, it could be blogging. It could be finding some other smaller way. It could be giving a lunch and learn at your company. But if you start to share your ideas, it really makes an impact. It gives people a way to see what you're thinking, to resonate with that, and to say, "Oh, I like the way she thinks. We need to bring her on." So, maybe your version of that is blogging on LinkedIn or Viadeo or something like that. Similarly, this gentleman here, also a case study in Standout, is named Robert Scoble. We're all busy, maybe you say, "Well, I don't have time to blog," or whatever, but I love what Robert Scoble did. He actually took a sort of similar principle. There's a question and answer website that you guys may have heard of. It's called Quora, Quora. And so people post questions online, and then other people answer them, and the best answers are upvoted. And so Robert Scoble is considered a real influencer in the technology space. And he would get a lot of emails asking him a lot of questions. And what he did that I thought was brilliant was he would write back to people and say, "I can't answer you on email, but please put the question on Quora and I'll answer it there." And the reason he did it was, A, of course, it saved him labor because, instead of emailing people the answer to the same question all the time, he could put it in one place and then lots of people could see it. But it's really understanding we only have 24 hours in a day. And if we really want to scale our impact, he said that what he loved was that instead of helping one person with the answer, he could help 5 people or 50 people or 500 people. And so maybe just even something like answering questions on Quora as a way of sharing your expertise can be something that's valuable. So the real question that I ask you guys is, out of these ideas, I'm hoping that something here resonates, that you can pick even just one piece that can enable you to get started on something additional that you're doing to advance your personal brand. And whether that's starting to share some content or just getting clearer about how you're connecting the dots when you tell your own story. So I'll shift in a minute to just answering some of the last questions, but I'll mention very briefly that if folks want to go even further into this, on my website, which is dorieclark.com, I have a free resource. It's a standout self-assessment questionnaire that actually helps kind of walk you through thinking about how to find your own breakthrough idea. So if you go to dorieclark/join, Join, you can download that for free and sort of walk through the questions to begin to get some clarity there. So some other questions that have come in, I'll answer briefly. Douglas wants to know, how does your model work for a political candidate? Great question, since I did, in fact, work in politics. I will say, basically, this is adapted pretty much straight away from the work that I did with candidates in politics. The only other thing that I would say, there's kind of one additional factor in politics as compared to in business, because in politics, of course, you typically have one, let's say you win the primary, you have sort of one key opponent that you need to differentiate yourself from. It's a little bit less head-to-head in the business world typically. And so if your key strength is you're great on education and their key strength is they're great on education, then it becomes a problem because you cancel each other out and nobody can tell the difference about how you're better. So even if education is your primary strength, you need in politics to look at what's going on with your opponent and say, oh, if that's their key strength too, I need to find something else. I need to find a secondary strength that I have so that I can position that as being different. And use that to my advantage. So I hope that that helps. And then the last question that came through is from Amandine. Hello. So you said, do you think producing content like articles is a major point for personal branding? So I've got to say, I am a big fan of it, as you can see from the stories that I told about Miranda and Robert Scoble. Really, I created a framework about how to become a recognized expert, and ultimately being a recognized expert it involves three things. One is social proof, which is basically your credibility. What are your credentials? Why should people listen to you? Number two is your network. So do you have a network of people around you that can give you good feedback on your ideas and also are willing to help you spread your ideas? Those are very important. But the third part, which is also essential, is content creation. Because the truth is, if people don't know what your ideas are, they're not going to know if your ideas are any good. So finding a way to share that somehow, whether that's blogging or podcasting or answering questions on Quora, maybe it's sharing ideas on an internal company site that your company might use, like Yammer. It varies company to company, but those things are all really valuable as ways of creating thought leadership, putting it out there and letting people know that you do have real expertise in what you do. So guys, I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I'm going to hand this back to Laura to wrap up. But I just wanted to thank you for taking the time on your Friday night to hang out and share some ideas. I hope it's been helpful for you. Again, if you have further questions, if you want to email me, you can shoot me a note. You can find a contact form on my website, dorieclark.com. You can download the free guide and sort of work through the questions yourself if that's helpful. And good luck with everything. Laura, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dorie. That was great and very inspiring as always. Well, Dorie didn't have time to answer back to all of you, but just don't worry, we'll do a quick video with Dorie so she can answer back to you, and then we'll send you the link as soon as possible. Now it's time. Don't leave us. There is the evaluation. So it's very short, very important for us to improve ourselves. So just a few questions. If you can answer back, it's going to be on your screen on 2 seconds. And once you finish, please feel free to disconnect. Before you go, I would like to thank Dorie, as always, for taking this time and joining us, and for all of you from all over the world. And friends, I can just wish you a wonderful weekend, and we'll be in touch by email and to advise you on the next webinar.